Welcome, everybody, to our continuing interview series where we talk to people around America, some on the left, some on the right, some in academia, some in activism, some who are philosophers, some who are columnists, reporters, writers. We don't care as long as you can have intelligent conversations and bring your perspective. We're providing perspectives from a variety of Americans who don't necessarily agree with each other directly to you, the public, so that you can do this thing that was really cool back in high school when I was a kid in high school, but it's not that popular anymore, but we're still asking you to do it now. It's called Think for Yourself. Maybe we'll bring it back. Maybe we'll have a renaissance moment. We'll see. With us today is Professor Peter Thomas Coleman. He's a professor of psychology and education at the Teachers College of Columbia University. And he's also the author of the book, The Way Out, How to Overcome Toxic Polarization. He's the director of the Morton Deutsch International Center for Cooperation, Conflict Resolution. He's also the co-director for the Advanced Consortium for Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity, the Earth Institute at Columbia University. He's the professor of psychology and education at Columbia University, where he holds appointments at Teachers College, the Climate School, and the School of Professional Studies. Dr. Coleman directs the Morton Deutsch International Center for Cooperation, is a founding member of the Institute for Psychological Science and Practice, and is a co-executive director of Columbia University's Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity, AC4. Dr. Coleman is a renowned expert on constructive conflict resolution and sustainable peace. His current research focuses on promoting conflict intelligence and systemic wisdom as meta competencies for navigating conflict constructively across all levels, from families to companies to communities to nations, which includes projects on adaptive negotiation and mediation, cross-cultural conflict, adaptivity, optimal dynamics and conflict, justice and polarization, multicultural conflict, intractable conflict, and sustainable peace. Dr. Coleman became the first recipient of the Early Career Award from the American Psychological Association in 2003. In 2015, he was awarded the Morton Deutsch Conflict Award from the European Union and a Marie Curie Fellowship from the European Union, very prestigious. In 2018, Dr. Coleman was awarded the Peace Award from Meaningful World in celebration of the 30th anniversary of the UN's International Day of Peace. Here's some of the other recipients and awards. He's won awards in 2018, 2017, 2016, 2015, 2014, all at the international level, all at conflict studies and resolving them and bringing peace to the world. This is the book we're going to talk about today. But before we get to that, Professor, did I get anything wrong? Is there something we need to correct about your bio?
No, I think that that's a lot of information, but mostly I study, peace and conflict. I study very difficult conflicts that get stuck for long periods of time and how, when they change. And I study peaceful societies that thrive for sometimes hundreds of years. So I study the extremes. That's mostly what I do with my time.
You are a sociologist?
I'm a social psychologist by training.
What is, just for our audience, for a lay person, pretend they're at a 10th grade level.
Sure.
What is a social psychologist and how is that different from a sociologist?
Sociologists mostly study institutions and their effect on human beings. We study interactions between certain kinds of social conditions and other human beings. So we really are more about interactions. And so focusing on conflict or peaceful relations between people or members of groups, that's one of the things that social psychologists study.
Okay, so you're well suited to talk about how there might be 2 million, 100 million person-sized camps in America that really don't like each other and have difficulty getting along. That's excellent. This book, The Way Out, How to Overcome Toxic Polarization, was written relatively recently. Why did you write this book, and why did you write it now? And when you answer, please come as both an academic and just an average American who has 2 eyeballs.
Okay. Yeah, I wrote this book because around 2017, 2018, when the political, poison was increasing in the country, when there's a lot of really hostile rhetoric, more and more, and people were anxious about it. And there were a lot of well-intentioned nonprofit groups trying to bring, red and blue or Republican, Democrat together in conversation. And that was a good idea, but it seemed to me they started to consult with me. And what I realized is that they didn't understand the science behind what they were doing. They, again, we're trying to do good things, but oftentimes they backfired, because people are so passionate about these. So I decided to write this book because I've been doing research on this for 30 years. And some of our research is directly relevant to this, but there are a lot of people doing good research for decades now on polarization and intergroup conflict, how to bring it down to a more constructive dynamic. And I'm concerned about the trajectory of this country. We've been getting worse in terms of political polarization and blaming the other side since the late 1970s, but we're on this sort of runaway train to a point where a majority of both red and blue Americans are blaming. We feel that the worst threat against our country is them, not climate change, not a bad economy, not guns, but them, the other party. And so we've really oversimplified this world and vilified half the country, and that's not sustainable. There are people like Barbara Walter, who is a political scientist who's written How Civil Wars Start, and she's been documenting that we're seeing rises in kind of militant violence. January 6th was one event, but there have been a lot of other low-level events that are increasing in their propensity. And so I'm concerned about the future of the country. And so that's why I wrote the book and why I wanted to bring good science to bear on how do we get out of it.
Oh, I got a couple of questions on that. But before we get to those,
yeah.
You said you started noticing that Americans were blaming each other since the 1970s, but then also in 2017, the political poison was noticeably increasing.
Yeah.
That's a huge gap of time. Is there another point where you can say, maybe in the 90s, maybe in the 80s, maybe in the 2010s, where you go, I noticed the difference too. I'm just wondering if you could throw in maybe one or two other marker dates between the 70s and 2017 where you can go, I noticed, maybe it's scientifically backed, maybe it's not, but I noticed something. I noticed that's really different than how we've been doing the last couple of years. Is there a few other key dates between the 70s and 2017 that you could throw in there for the audience?
Yeah, totally. I mean, again, it's, what has been happening. So again, when I say the late 1970s, I'm looking at data in terms of how politicians, work together or work against each other in Washington and in state capitals. And I'm looking at attitudes of Americans towards them, towards the other side since the late 70s. What you don't see is, kind of a linear increase, and that it's just boiling slowly. You do see these sort of jumps and plateaus and jumps and plateaus. So, the Republican Revolution and Newt Gingrich was, sort of this, he said politics is war. And so that ethos that really took hold in Washington at that time was a sort of tipping point. But the 2010 was another tipping point when social media not only was becoming more pervasive, but when the like button came out and when the function of social media changed from just sort of sharing information with your friends to building these communities that affirm you and that you can move into a bubble with. So there have been these things, accelerants. Donald Trump was an accelerant. His approach to leading and politics and the sort of divisiveness through which he brought in his campaigns and brought as a president. There are a variety of things that have happened. We've also been, the foreign actors have tried to weaponize our divisions. They understand our divisions, our racial divisions, religious, ethnic, gender divisions, and they've been operating. So, yes, there have been moments where you see these big upticks, but I have to say, the problem with understanding a problem like this that is, multiple decades long in the making is that there is no really one actor or event to blame. It's a combination of complicated things that start to feed each other and sort of takes on a life of its own. And some of the things I talked about make a difference, but so does the fact that, news reporting went from just being a sort of boring common, thing that the networks did for the common good to making money, right? And getting attention. And when there are these kinds of huge changes in the business models of how our news is presented to us, that has an impact on us as well. But none of these things alone can explain this, 50-year pattern we're on. it's how they kind of feed each other and play into each other that, becomes bigger than all of us.
When do you feel that you noticed news reporting changing from reporting the news to being about making money? I'm not asking for a scientific date, just an observation point.
Well, anecdotally, people refer to it sometimes as the 60 Minutes effect, because before 60 Minutes, the television investigative journalism showed 60 Minutes, news didn't make any money, right? News was, again, something that it was what they call a loss leader. It was something they did for the common good. But then suddenly this news program got tons of attention, got people wanting to, advertise on it. And that was a game changer. And so the network, executives noticed this and they thought, oh, we can actually make money with certain kinds of news, particularly if it's provocative and really captures people's attention. So the whole, so some have referred to this as the 60-minute effect, not that 60 Minutes set out to do that, but it was an artifact of its popularity and its effectiveness, and that it was, something that actually made money for the industry, and that was a tipping point.
So everybody following along, the professor saying he noticed the change in the 1970s. Then we can go up to Nate Gingrich around 1992. I was familiar with that, and I remember he said, no more hanging out with people of the other party after the workday. That was a massive change. Then we can go to 2010. Social media was no longer about connecting people, but about finding yourself in an ideological community. Somewhere along the way, 60 Minutes changed the profit margin. And now what we've noticed is that there's a lot of data showing that politicians deal with each other in Congress very differently now, and the public views the other side very differently. But it's not a straight linear incline. It's a jump, plateau, jump, plateau, jump, plateau. That makes a lot of sense. Providing a lot of original information we haven't seen. I want to push back though on one thing though. Come on, Professor. Donald Trump's the problem here. He started all this. If he wasn't here, America worked perfectly fine before him. Yeah, we had some problems, but no division like this. It's all Trump. He's to fault. It's his blame. There were no problems before him. And if he's just gone and nobody supports them, then everything goes back to normal. I've heard experts say this. You're saying the total opposite. Who's to be believed?
Well, again, Trump, like the internet, is an accelerant, right? He's a brand of politics, of leadership, of divisiveness. Really, is his core brand is part of what's happening, but you can't blame it all on Trump. Look, Trump would have never been elected 10 years before he was elected. The conditions were ripe to have a leader that really, saw how the country was divided, played on it, preyed on it, actually switched sides, because he used to be much more progressive in a lot of his policies and thought, oh, no, here's half the country that needs, is hungry for a leader. So in some ways, he was able to see that, like Roger Ailes, who saw that there was half of the country that wasn't getting news that it was interested or comfortable with. And so he thought, okay, here's an audience. And he made that decision as well. Of course, he then weaponized Fox News in some ways. But so did they, and then they, of course, feed each other, right? Roger Ailes, Fox News, loved Donald Trump initially, not anymore, but initially, right? And so they kind of fed each other. And that's what I mean, is that there are these things that happen, or these leaders that come along, or events that take place, and they do fuel each other and create this dynamic that's just so hard to even understand, let alone stop.
Okay, I'm going to do this. I was going to wait to ask this, but it kind of got my mind on fire. So let me go right to, this isn't the main thing I wanted to ask you, but I got it. So you mentioned Barbara F. Walter.
I think, right.
And her book, How Civil Wars Start. There it is. I've talked to quite a few professors. There were a lot of professors who've never heard of this book or this point, but have studied political polarization. That was the first thing that shocked me. And when I showed it to them, a lot of faces just went like white. The blood left their face. And at the moment I explained to them who this was and who this book was, and that you can't just dismiss it. Because when I said it, they're like, man, whatever. Lots of people say civil wars. And I go, sorry, I understand a lot of people do, but we're talking about somebody who's a professional analyst for the CIA for decades, has created, with many other scholars, a kind of a litmus test to see when a country's about to fall. It's been in place for decades, and it has been highly successful at predicting these things.
Yep.
When I pointed all that out, and then I read the quote where she's saying America's now tracking off on all those metrics, there's at least 5 or 7 professors where the blood went out of their face. They went from, what's that book about? Nah, that can't be true.
Yeah.
To you explain it to them too. So I didn't take that as a good sign. I thought if you're studying political polarization, you probably should have heard about this book, because this book is pretty damn scary. It says that America is going to a place that a lot of collapsed countries do, and that we're ticking off on the metrics. And Barbara F. Walters says straight up, a lot of Americans have this Pollyannish view that it can never happen here, and you guys are dead wrong. That is absolutely what she says. One of the things she points at, though, is I think she said there was 2 conditions to make it work. Was you had to have an anocracy, I believe is the term. I could be getting that wrong. Basically a not really well-functioning democracy, what I call a Soviet Union sort of election system. When I had to read about the Soviet Union, they would have elections, people would get elected, but the public just kind of voted because you had to, not because they really felt they had power. And the politicians would get in, and then they would kind of do whatever they want, and the public didn't really feel they were responsive to them. There was some joke about, we'll pretend to vote you in, and then you pretend to govern. So that's an old, I had to take a Soviet language class or whatever. So that was how they viewed it. And I go, oh, so kind of like people just doing the motions, but nobody really believes they have power. Nobody really believes they're picking the people that people wanted. And then you have that condition, fertile soil. And then rising within that is the plant, the seed, ethnic hero, ethnic leader. Hey, our group used to be in charge. And now we're losing. And I am the one that can bring us back to the good old days, like Rwanda, like Syria. And so when I hear you talk about Trump, she says, was the ethnic hero. And then I found it very intriguing when you said, look, Trump never would have been elected 10 years before he was. The conditions had to be so polluted and rotten for him to be able to grow. I mean, Trump's a scumbag, I'll say it. But if the ground wasn't rotten enough, that little mushroom of him couldn't have grown. That sounds like you're describing the same conditions that Walter is, where she's saying crappy level democracy, ethnic hero pops up, civil war happens. Is that how you feel? Do you feel that we're somewhat similar? We're ticking along the way she's saying, or is she taking it too far?
Well, again, I'm not surprised that some academics that you talk to either didn't know of this or, didn't believe it or agree with it, because, polarization is a complicated thing, and people study it in very different ways. A lot of people study what they call affective polarization, which is just how we feel towards the other side. It's an emotional dynamic, you're right. They don't worry too much about the political structures. And so, if you're really deep in your research, sometimes you're missing some of these other, narratives that are coming out of political science, or, as you say, intelligence, and looking at more kind of structural conditions. I think they're both important. They're both necessary to understand. I think her analysis is more parsimonious than mine. What I agree with those conditions that you pose, but I also think that there's no one thing that contributes to this. It's also, gerrymandering. It's also the internet. It's also the entertainmentization of news. It's also the fact that physically, Americans, red and blue Americans, are moving away from each other, not just, into the cities to be blue and into the country or rural areas to be red, but even within cities, you're seeing segregation happening into neighborhoods that are much more strong red or blue and not purple. Somebody said that at the midterm elections, 98% of the precincts in this country are considered either majority dominant blue or red, not purple. They're not balanced. So we're physically moving into these tribes. Those kinds of conditions are self-perpetuating. right? And they do contribute to this kind of problem. So, yes, I think she's right that the soil was present and could be more easily manipulated or weaponized by a politician. I think Trump was able to do that. But I also think that now Trumpism has transcended Trump, and it is a more pervasive phenomenon. And it is because those conditions are ripe. And I wouldn't boil them down to just a couple of things. I think it's more complicated than that. That's, the only issue I have with her book. I think her analysis is important because she's sort of saying, look, don't think the Civil War is going to be like the 1850s and 60s where you have, teams on a field in uniforms with muskets. This is going to be very different. It's going to be decentralized. It's going to be more like terrorists' cells that can exist in places and then, organize suddenly. One of the things I noted is last Christmas Day, there were across 5 states, there were multiple attacks on power substations across America, across these 5 states that were coordinated attacks on infrastructure. And that is an example of what she's talking about, which is the rise of these militant groups that go after things that make our life harder or make it more impossible to govern because they want to sow the seeds of dissent in order to get people to, basically get angry, right? And build up that resentment. So yes, there is, look, our country is changing dramatically in terms of demographics. They're going to be, a majority of states are going to have minority groups as majority in those states, in 20 years. So there's this huge demographic change. White people, middle class, particularly if you're left behind in 2007, 2008, and you've never recovered, are pissed. So white grievance is definitely part of the mix. But what I want to be careful about doing is identifying any kind of red herring, any one thing that says it's Trump, it's, the economic downturn, it's gerrymandering, it's the media, it's Mark Zuckerberg and his weaponization, it's his allowing what Facebook to be weaponized the way it is. All of that is true, but none of that alone accounts for this. And what we try to do as humans is find the thing. What's the thing that we can fix? What I'm saying here is there ain't a thing we can fix. It's a complicated problem, and our response is going to have to, meet that complication. Has to be a lot of different kinds of initiatives in order to put this in check and reverse the flow.
I have another question.
Yeah.
But I do want to back up something you had said that, yes, when we're looking at the book on Civil War by Barbara F. Walter, she did say it's not going to be gray and blue and 100,000 person armies marching directly at her. I've heard people compare it more to the Italian years of lead, Años de Pombi or Años de Pombo, meaning kind of a lot of people were shot. There was a lot of violence. Judges are being shot, police officers are being shot, politicians are being shot. Like not a lot of mass killing, but very destabilizing people in power on both sides, and a multi-year period where they just couldn't seem to get out of it, and people were very worried about the collapse of the Italian state. That reminds me of the period called Bleeding Kansas. A lot of people who study the Civil War forget about the period of Bleeding Kansas. We did not, as Americans, go right to, let's start shooting at each other at Bull Run. That's not how it happened. Americans had a period where they thought, oh my God, we can't shoot other Americans. But then they kept reading these dispatches from a state or territory called Kansas. And they would read about Southerners who shot Northerners in cold blood. And then they'd read about Northerners who shot Southerners in cold blood. So you had Bleeding Kansas for about 7 years before you ever had the Civil War, kind of prepping people mentally for doing this. And it looks very similar to the Italian years of lead and very similar to what Walters is talking about the Civil War. But the question that I had for you was this one. Entertainmentization of the news. You're talking about the 60 Minutes model. Let's say that started 2010-ish, maybe.
I think earlier than that. I mean, I think that news corporations recognized the power of 60 Minutes way before that. And so news started to move towards entertainmentization. I think it became more politicized probably around, well, it's hard to say, somewhere between 2000 and 2010. And so you start to see Fox News take off, you see Breitbart take off, and then you see CNN, drift left, and you see MSNBC as well. So this has been happening for a while. I don't know if I've nailed down the entertainment or the news industry timeline effectively yet, but it's been happening over time, and now it's part of the problem.
Sure. The question I have is this: when Marjorie Taylor Greene came out, and I get not everybody's a big fan. Some people like her, some people don't. She came out with a statement on President's Day, and it was very controversial and designed to be clickbait, and it was. And she was inartful, and she didn't explain it well, but the conversation got going. Yeah. I saw the first month that she said that there were 30 different newspapers who said, "Oh, Marjorie, you idiot. We don't have polarization. What are you talking about?" Yeah. And then when that didn't work and the conversation kept going that she started for 3-4 weeks, the very next month I saw a new angle. Okay, yeah, we got polarization, but it's because of mass media. It's because of gerrymandering. It's because of social media. And the one thing that got me was that no one mentioned what you mentioned. We've been sorting into red and blue segregated communities. Here's the question for you. Yeah. How did 30 newspapers, basically all of the mainstream news on the left and the right, they were able to mention mass media entertainment, they were able to mention social media, they were able to mention gerrymandering, but they weren't able to mention the big sort, or us sorting into like-minded communities, even though that predates all of the other conditions by 10 to 20 years. Yeah. How did 30 newspapers accidentally forget to mention anything along the lines of sorting, as you mentioned, and went after these other 3 culprits when the sorting predates all of those options?
Well, I think, to be honest with you, I think it's because of how we're educated as a society. There was a philosopher named Karl Popper who was a big mind in the philosophy of science. And he said, in science and in life, there are 2 kinds of problems. There are clock problems and there are cloud problems. And he said, clock problems are a lot of the problems we face. And it's typically how we think about problem solving. Something, a clock breaks, you take it apart, you find the broken spring, you replace it, and it goes back to normal, right? If a family is in distress, you bring them into family therapy, you find out what the issues are, you resolve those, you put it back together, they're fine, right? Medicine, somebody's sick, you go in, you diagnose it, you treat it. We have this fix-it mentality, and basically what that encourages us to do is find the thing to fix. And so that's how we've been educated, that's how we've been trained, that's what we understand as problem solving. What Karl Popper said is, there's a class of problems that are not clocks. They're not mechanical like that. You can't take them apart and fix a thing and it goes back to normal. They're what he calls cloud problems. They're complicated things that interact in weird ways. And you may go in with good intentions and do something that you think is great, and it backfires or it doesn't work at all. And that's what we've been finding with, for example, pro and anti-Trump conversations. Pew Research has found that the vast majority of both left and right in this country, if they get into conversations with somebody on the other side, first of all, good on them for trying to sit down and talk to somebody on the other side. But most of them walk away feeling more pissed off and more alienated and more frustrated. And, because it doesn't help. It's insufficient to the problem. So, what these newspapers are doing is what we all do, which is we try to find the 2 or 3 things that we think really matter and highlight those. And of course, the media understands the media. They understand the business model. Or mainstream media is trying to blame social media, But yeah, that's what's salient to them. That's what they're focusing on. And all I'm saying is they're not wrong in that those things are playing a role, but they're not the whole story.
I had a theory, and I'd like to ask your opinion on it. And if you don't think it makes sense and it's crazy, just say, that seems kind of crazy, Mark. That's fine. All right. But if you think maybe, I'm not saying endorsement, but if it's not crazy, if you'd say, hey, that's not totally insane.
Okay.
I've asked a couple of professors this. So it goes like this. Polarization's bad. January 6th, man, it's bad. I'm scared. Well, if it's social media, we can pass a law to regulate social media. If
Right.
it's gerrymandering and extreme politicians, we could pass a law to kind of reel that in, maybe change the primaries. If it's entertainmentization of the media, maybe we could bring back a fair play ruling for the news. These are things that could be done in a year or two. If all of Congress came together and the American people, we could pass a law and we could fix this.
Yeah.
But if it's the big sort
Hmm.
that since the 1990s, basically 3 decades, around 100 million people, or millions at least, have been moving and sorting themselves into ideological communities, that is not something that gets fixed with the law. That is going to be a slow, multi-generational, painful, 100 million person involved change. And so that's depressing. That's a maybe. That's hard work. That takes a lot of time. That means I have to tell you, the reader, you have to do something, and I don't have a quick fix. Let's scrap all that. You know what's more positive? Hey, folks, we could fix all this in 2 years with new legislative changes. So let's just not talk about anything that's negative and would be say, oh, I'm sorry, guys, it's going to take another 30 years to undo it. And you're going to involve you and your grandma and your mom. And it's not something you can pass on to elected officials.
Yeah.
Roll up your sleeves and get ready for a hard time for the next generation. That's depressing. Let's not talk about that at all. Is that a crazy theory of mine?
No, it's not a crazy theory. Again, I think you're right that politicians, business leaders, they offer solutions that they can get their head around and feel like they can do something about. But I guess what I want to say is all of these things that you're talking about, the big sort, gerrymandering, the media, all of these things are both cause and effect. They are drivers, and they feed other things, and those other things increase and feed the drivers, right? So these things are going back and forth in these complicated ways. And that's why this has become like a cultural problem. This is something that's baked into American culture right now. And we, of all the G7 countries, of all the more developing regions of the world, our trajectory and polarization is the most stark of all of them. Now, ironically, we're also coming out of COVID financially better than the rest of them. So we're functioning on some levels, but our hate and blame and vilification for the other side is at a historic level for us, and is rising at a rate that is really intolerant, unsustainable. And again, some of it is the big sort, but these things are not. None of those things account for any one. Are any one primary driver. They're all how they work together. But let me say this just so I can, because I feel it starts to get hopeless. It starts to feel like, we're in this,
I was going to bring it back to your book. Promise.
Well, yeah, no, what I was going to suggest is that I was just going to suggest one analogy that's a story of a group that I think has done this right. Because they work on what they can work on and are changing what they can change, not everything, and what they're working on will make a big difference. Can I tell that story?
Please.
So this is a group. It's a terrible name called the Select Committee for the Modernization of Congress.
I read their report.
Okay, great. And it's these select committees are mechanisms that Congress has when they get broken, they offer them. The last select committee that they had passed absolutely nothing. They couldn't work together. This select committee that ran for 2 years, it was only supposed to be one, they extended it for another year, passed something like I think 300, 400 recommendations that they passed on to the leadership. And most of them, about 2/3 of them, have been implemented already. So why do I say this? What their mandate was that Congress is broken, they're polarized, that we hate each other, we don't talk to each other, and that's got to change. And then January 6th happened, and a lot of them were, afraid for their lives, and yet their job was to look at why are they so broke in Congress and how can they fix that. And they spent 2 years doing this. And the leadership of this group, these are 6 Republicans, 6 Democrats, 2 co-chairs. They shared decision-making. They shared the budget. They shared the same staff. They were very smart in how to say, okay, Congress is sick and broken. What do we do about this? Like, what are the specific things? And they came up with a host of recommendations to change the incentive structures around Congress. Let me give you one example. One of the things that congressional leadership does is when new Congress people come to, are elected and come to Washington, the first thing they do is they put them on a blue bus and a red bus and send them off in different directions to strategize about how to take down the other side. That's that's on day one. And so one recommendation of this committee was, don't do that. Don't start there. Give them a week to hang out with each other, recognize the enormity of the responsibility of what they've been given, and then they can go off and do some things, but allow them to humanize and socialize a little bit. This is something that Newt Gingrich had an impact on because, as you said, in the 90s, when he was the Speaker of the House, he changed the work week from 5 days to 3 days. And what he said to his, so they used to come, so basically Congress used to move their families to DC and their kids would grow up together. He said, we're going to change it from 5 days to 3 days. Don't move here. Stay in your home state. Keep your families there. Don't fraternize with the other side. And by the way, stay there more often so you can raise more money because this is politics as war. But what that did is it removed the kids going to school together and in sports together and in choir together, growing up in these communities where your kids met with the other side's kids and you knew them. And you had these kinds of relationships. He surgically removed that. Again, I get it. I understand it from a political perspective, how he saw that as powerful. It did profound harm to the socialization process of politicians in Washington. And this is what one of the things that the Select Committee has been trying to address. They recognize that this is politics as war. One of the simple things they found out is that there's no space for a congressperson to talk to somebody on the other side that doesn't have a camera. So there are cameras everywhere now. And so if I'm talking to you, you're a Republican, I'm a Democrat, I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to my base because this camera's covering me and I know somebody's going to snatch some footage from it and put it on the news tonight. So we're not having real conversations between, these leaders are not talking to each other. They're performing for their base. That's got to stop. That was one of the recommendations, is give them some place to go where they can have real honest conversations, share their own ambivalence, and figure out how to fix these things that isn't a public performance for their base. So I just wanted to offer the Select Committee as one example of a 2-year project that was, they were focused on how do we fix Congress. We're in Congress. We don't want another January 6th. We're, really concerned about the future of democracy. Let's look at the incentive structures, change enough of them so that we can grow a new culture over time in Congress. That's what they did. I think that they did it pretty effectively. That work continues now in different other committees. In fact, I'm going down to speak to the what's it called, the bipartisan working group, which is a group that is 10 of each side working together on legislation.
Oh, wow.
So I'm going to go down there next week to talk about this. And so there are these other attempts to repair the epicenter of our division, which has been Congress.
And what was the name? It was the Congressional Select Committee on How to Improve Less Division. I read this report, but I'm forgetting the title.
They called it the Select Committee for the Modernization of Congress. That's a standard term that they use for this mechanism that they call these every once in a while to fix something that's broken.
Right.
The mandate of this group was to particularly look at how dysfunctional Congress is, and particularly because of the divisiveness and the polarization and the partisanship. So that's what their mandate was for 2 years. I'll give it a plug. There's a great piece by Amanda Ripley, who's a journalist who testified for this group, the Select Committee. She wrote an opinion in the Washington Post about a month ago, which is just profiling what they did, and it captures the story of the Select Committee And I think it should be known by more people because it's promising, right? These are leaders, well-intentioned, trying to make things better in the halls of Congress, where we had a riot 2 years ago.
We spoke with Anna Bell Holt, Congress William Timmons.
Yeah. So William Timmons
William-
was the co-chair. Yes.
Okay. Congressman William
Timmons was so Derek Kilmer and William Timmons were the co-chairs. Timmons is a Republican, I think, from South Carolina. Kilmer is a Washington State Democrat. They were co-chairs the second year of the select committee.
We talked to Madison Hall, who referred us to Annabelle Holt, who works for Congressman William Timmons, and we were trying to find somebody to interview about the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress final report. Chair Derek Kilmer, Vice Chair Tom Graves, October report number 116562.
Yeah.
If any of these people want to be interviewed, I would love to interview them, but we're going to try to get at least one person from that committee. If I remember correctly, that, and this is where I want to get back to your book, but I could be wrong, but I don't remember that any of the recommendations were groundbreaking. They were kind of common sense, easygoing. I'm not trying to cartoon it, but I finished reading that report and I'm like, this sounds like all the stuff they teach you in kindergarten.
Yeah.
Don't hit, be nice. Don't punch someone in the face. Take a second. It was like, take a second to listen to them before you. I'm like, is my characterization way off? And if it's not, how does this provide reassurance to the American people? Hey, we have the smartest elected minds in all of America figuring out how to prevent another January 6th. And they came up with the most innovative solutions are all the stuff they teach you in kindergarten.
Yeah.
How does that?
Well, yeah.
I mean, why would they go, oh, we are on the track to fixing this? I feel that for sure.
Yeah. Right. So let me give you an analogy. Imagine if you live in a home with an addict who's, the mother or father is a drug addict, and you have a pathological system. You love them, you love each other, but you're all in some ways contributing to that. And at some point, either the addict dies or something horrible happens, and you really, as a community, have to say, okay, we don't want to live like this anymore. We want to take a different direction. I would liken what Congress is dealing with to an addicted family, a sick family, because I think Congress, the culture of Congress, has gotten sicker and sicker, and more dysfunctional, and lacking the capacity to problem solve around our major problems in this country. And so what they had to do is sort of say, all right, let's stop. I have to say, one of the things that I'm most impressed by, I understand what you mean. If you look at any one of the recommendations, there are smaller nudges like don't have cameras in a couple of rooms or don't socialize them this way. But together, they recognize that this isn't a simple problem. There's not one thing to do. There has to be a lot of things that they do. And they have to be mindful of where do they want to go? What's the culture that they're trying to grow? One of the things they did is they talked to coaches, football coaches. And they said, if you want to change the culture of your football team, how do you do that? And the coaches said, well, you start with the young players, the freshmen, because the older players are the culture, right? They're the symbol, they're enacting it, right? So you start with the socialization process. And so that's what this committee started to try to think about, is how do we grow a new culture in Congress over time? And what are the constellation of things we need to do in order to start that shift happening now? So these things are not going to change Congress overnight, but they're very promising, I think, in the long term. And I want to just really emphasize, this was extremely hard to do. This is not standard practice in Congress right now of sitting down and problem solving with one another. And as I said, they started to do this, and then January 6th happened. And so not only some of them,
Oh, wow.
not only, Kilmer talks about he was in his office by himself, alone for 5 hours, barricaded, watching CNN on mute and texting with his family because he didn't know if he was going to make it through the day. Okay. That's the chair. And a lot of them had these stories. And some of the other members of this committee then voted to not accept the election, right? So they were angry at each other. They were afraid. This was a mess. And under these conditions, they were asked to do this thing. They were very smart about how they did it. They had sessions where these people told their stories about concern about election fraud, their stories about fear for their own life that day. That's where they started. And so the process of just them coming together and working together and then beginning to find some of the flaws and some of the nudges that they can introduce to start to change the culture. It's a very impressive process that I tell you, not many people could pull off. This group was able to pull it off.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's go with that. And that, by the way, this is the name of the report, Select Committee of Modernization and Congress Report, Chair, number 116562, Chapter 2, Encourage Civility and Bipartisanship in Congress.
Yeah.
We're going to try to interview one of the Congress members. We'll see if we can. This is the report. I wanted to get to that, but first I want to go to your book.
Yeah.
And ask a question about that. So when we look at the book, it's the same thing. How do we get out of toxic polarization? I find some similarity between that and what Congress is doing. Let me just read the introduction of the book, and I have a question, if that's okay.
Sure, go ahead.
The partisan divide in the United States has widened to a chasm. Legislators vote along party lines and rarely cross the aisle. Political polarization is personal too, and it is making us miserable. Surveys show Americans have become more fearful and hateful of supporters of the opposing political party and imagine that they hold much more extreme views than they actually do. I've seen a lot of that. We have cordoned ourselves off. We prefer to date and marry those with similar opinions, seen that, and are less willing to spend time with people on the other side, seen that. How can we loosen the grip of toxic polarization, start working on our most pressing problems? The Way Out offers an escape from this morass. The social psychologist Peter T. Coleman explores how conflict resolution and complexity science provide guidance for dealing with seemingly intractable political differences. Deploying the concept of attractors in dynamical systems, he explains why we are stuck in this rut, as well as the unexpected ways that deeply rooted oppositions can and do change. Coleman meticulously details principles and practices for navigating and healing the difficult divides in our homes, workplaces, and communities. So your book is about suggestions on healing the divide. Congress was looking at the divide. But I want to bring up a phrase you had said earlier. I forget exactly who we were talking about, but good on them for trying.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, some people don't know how to do this or apply the science of bringing people together correctly.
Yeah.
What is the science of bringing people together correctly? Is that what you're talking about in your book? Is that what Congress is doing? And how do people get it wrong?
So in the 1950s, there's a social psychologist named Gordon Allport who was doing a lot of race relation work. And he wrote a book called The Psychology of Prejudice. And it really is about what they call contact theory, right? So if you're a member of some group, some tribal group, I'm a member of another tribal group, and we never have contact, but I hear a lot about you, you hear a lot about me, we can start to ruminate and really escalate and hate each other. If you bring those people together, members of those tribes together, to actually break bread, hang out, get to know each other, meet their kids, realize that they are good dancers, they love music, it changes the dynamic. Then you can see the soul of the other, you can humanize the other, right? And that's done through what they call contact theory. And so this was something that Gordon Allport created wrote about, and then there have been hundreds of studies, thousands of studies on contact theory. The problem is that contact theory only works, it's only useful under certain conditions. And that's what I think a lot of well-intentioned groups who say, okay, there's a group called Our Country Talks. It's in 30 different countries, including the US. And every year they have a thing and they say, okay, here's a website answer these questions on these issues. Here's somebody in your neighborhood that's on the other side of gun control than you are. Go off and have a cup of coffee or a beer with them and talk about them. Get to know them. Well, okay, that can work sometimes, but if you're really deep in a pro-anti-Trump narrative or in a pro-gun, anti-gun, narrative, gun control narrative, and you sit down with somebody just to shoot the shit about gun control, it's likely going to blow up. And that's what happens, right? Because what they don't understand about contact theory is it works effectively under certain conditions. And one of the conditions is that you start by getting to know people as human beings. You don't jump into an issue like gun control, which frankly, most people don't really understand. They just have a position that, their leader tells them they should have. But, so A, you don't start with politics, you start with just life. And B, really important, is that contact helps when it's ongoing. If you and I go to the same diner and know the same people every once in a while, even though we differ politically, but we show up there once a week or twice a week, we have some kind of relationship, right? We know each other. We know, I see your daughter, I see your family, I see what you eat, what you don't eat. Oh, you've got a medical problem. Oh, so we have context, right? That's the kind of contact that matters. It's desegregated housing, it's sports teams, it's political parties that have different religious and ethnic group members, right? Those are the structures that you need to have. Those are the things I talked about earlier that we're having less and less of in this country as we move away from each other. But just bringing people together for an encounter is today, I think, often unethical, because it can backfire, or even if it's done carefully, it's not enough. These things are oftentimes an hour and a half dinner conversation, something over red and blue Americans. You may feel like it's well facilitated and it goes pretty well, but the truth is it doesn't really change your attitude about them. It may change your attitude about the people you spoke to, but not about that whole group, right? And that's the problem, is many of these groups, these well-intentioned groups that are doing this, don't understand the limitations of what they're doing and the unintended consequences of what they're trying to do.
I wanted to focus on something you said, that I think the term is called cross-cutting communities. I was reading a book by Liliana Mason.
Yep.
Some other people mentioned, I'm sure there's different terms, but basically it goes like this. You used to have liberal Republicans, conservative Democrats. You used to have people say, okay, we're all in the bowling league together, and I'm a hardcore Republican and you're a hardcore Democrat.
Yeah.
At that time in '82, when we beat the other team, boy, that's my most favorite memory, and you and I share that, right? So
we love bowling. Absolutely.
We love bowling. I see you as a brother. I've known you for years. We're at the bowling league. I don't really talk about politics because I know we disagree, but I have a commonality. I see you as a person.
Yeah.
Regular interactions with the person.
Yeah.
And getting to know them as a human. My question, though, is at some point you have to talk about abortion, gun control, gerrymandering.
Yeah.
And even if you're really tight with this person and good friends, at some point it's going to come down to it.
Yeah.
Does getting to know the person, being friendly with them, having been in a community with them, make it more likely where the hardcore Republican and the hardcore Democrat come together and one of them goes, you know what? I was wrong. I changed my opinion to your view on abortion. I find I've seen people say this is the way that we bring people together. We have conversations. We don't talk about the tough stuff. And I'm like, great. But at some point you have to talk about the tough things because we're going to push a law.
Yeah.
Is avoiding difficult conversations the way to bring us together? Okay, so how do you go from we're cool with each other, but now we have to talk about abortion and come to an actual agreement? Is it 6 months, 3 months, whatever?
Yeah.
Does this make that final negotiation stage better, easier?
It makes it easier because you don't believe that the other side is evil and awful
Okay.
and are murderers. And this is, I begin the book the way out with a story of 6 women in Boston, 3 pro-life and 3 pro-choice women who were leaders in the Boston community in the 1990s, 80s, and 90s. And there was a terrible series of shootings in Brookline, Massachusetts, that just was traumatic and destabilized the community. And these 6 women who had worked their entire careers to obstruct and fight the other side agreed to sit down and meet and talk in secret in a dialogue process facilitated by 2 experts. And they did this, they agreed for a month that they would do it 4 times. They were terrified of the other side. First of all, they were terrified of the violence that had happened and the consequences of that. But they really thought, like the religious folks thought that sitting down with these people that, quote, had blood on their hands was a sin. And so it was very, very hard for these folks to do it. But they did it. They agreed to do it mostly because they wanted to prevent violence. They all felt that the rhetoric that they'd used in their activism had created the conditions where that could happen. So they wanted to bring that down. But that also meant that they had to sit with the enemy. They had to talk with the enemy. They did this for 4 weeks. Then they agreed to continue it a little longer. Then they continued it for a year. Then they decided to continue it more. And they spoke in secret, these 6 women, again, who are all community leaders on different sides of this issue, opposing sides of this issue. They spoke in secret for 5.5 years. In a dialogue process facilitated by a group called Central Partners. Now it was called something else then. And so what's important there is this. At the end of 5.5 years, these 6 women agreed to come out publicly. They hadn't told anybody that they were doing this, but they did do this. They sat through this process. They grew to really care for each other, respect each other. They really grew to love each other, frankly. And so their relationships became really important and thicker. And their attitudes on abortion became further apart. Let me explain that. If I'm used to using talking points and just saying nonsense or saying whatever I'm told to say about an issue, it's one thing. If I'm sitting with someone who I now care about and really respect, and I really want them to understand my experience, I'm very specific about my experience. And this happened on both sides. They ended this time. In 2001, the 6 women published a piece in the Boston Globe called "Talking with the Enemy," and it was an account of their experience. And their experience was difficult, profound, but they came to really respect and appreciate each other. They found things that they can work on together, like keeping violence out of this process, reducing the hateful rhetoric that they were using, and then also that they all cared about young women and unwanted pregnancies. And so they found a lot of things that they could work on together, and they still disagreed on this issue. The secret about life, when life begins, we don't know. Scientists don't know. It's all subjective. We really don't know when life actually begins. So it's all arbitrary on what we impose on that. What these women found is that they could trust and respect these other people, not vilify them as evil. They could reduce violence and hateful rhetoric in their community and actually in the country. And they could still really believe the opposite of what these women believe. They could hold that. That is what F. Scott Fitzgerald said is the essence of intelligence, the capacity to hold 2 contradictory ideas in your head at the same time and still function. And that's what they could do, is they could say, I love and respect these people, and I disagree with them fundamentally on this issue, and I can tolerate that.
Does it win friends and influence people?
I don't know. Who said that?
I thought that was the F. Scott Fitzgerald book.
No, F. Scott Fitzgerald is Great Gatsby. He's
Great Gatsby. Never mind. I'm
getting
I'm thinking of someone else.
Yeah.
So these people met together secretly for half a decade.
5.5 years. Yeah.
Yeah. And they had absolutely no coming together on a policy issue.
Doesn't matter. They affected the level, the probabilities of violence in their community around this
Sure.
issue.
Sure.
That was their goal. Remember,
Okay.
their goal was not, well, I'm sure they would have loved to persuade the other side and bring them over. That didn't happen. What did happen is that they took a hard look at their own activism and rhetoric and the conditions that they had created that brought on this violence. They took responsibility for it. They brought that rhetoric down. They found common ground. And this happened 25 years ago. They're still today friends. They still celebrate birthdays and deaths, and they're still close. So there's something extraordinary that can happen when people that are have fundamentally different views on important issues come together, humanize each other, see the soul in the other, and then even agree to disagree. There's something that's really powerful about that if we can allow ourselves into that space.
So maybe they don't agree on an exact policy, but they're not as upset about maybe losing that policy battle because they don't feel the other side is pure evil, Satan's henchman.
Yeah, absolutely. That has been debunked. That myth has been debunked.
I've read a lot of studies that have said that when you get to polarization, as a human, you're much more likely to think the worst things about the other side. You're much likely to think they don't even have common sense of decency like you, and they have the worst attitudes, and they're an enemy, and they're out to get you. It's very easy for humans. I was reading some study by Liliana Mason. She was saying, this basic psychology, we are hardwired to form a group and then create out groups. This is my group. You're not part of my group. And that's wired into us from an early age. I want to show you something, and then I want to ask another question.
Let me say one thing about that, though, because I know that science, there is neuroscience, that it's easy to us to have out groups, but those groups are also easy to overcome. Those divisions are easy to overcome. If we see a member of an out group as a threat, it triggers our amygdala, it triggers fear. But if suddenly we realize that, oh, they're also a Cub fan, it mitigates it. So when we have common identities, it can override those initial fears and bring us together. And that's an important thing to know, because I get worried about the idea of things being hardwired. We definitely, as a species, wandered around in hunter-gatherer groups, but there was no war in human societies until about 10,000 years ago. And we've been walking around this planet for 2 million years.
Right.
So there was violence, there was, competition, but there wasn't war. That's something that we've created when we settled down and gathered a lot of stuff. And then I said, oh, I want your stuff.
That's a brilliant point, because if you look at chimpanzees, chimpanzees do fight wars. They will have a leader who gets together with a stick. Yeah. And he makes a bunch of noise, and he gets all the other male chimpanzees together. And then they will literally walk as a group to the other chimpanzee camp and then go beat them down and take the territory. So you can have war in certain animals. And you're right. We were around for 100,000, 2 million years. We didn't have wars. We may have had little clan conflicts. One guy got stabbed with an arrow, but that'd be about it. It wasn't like all of us are going to line up and do a charge to destroy everyone on the. That didn't happen. You're right. Till agriculture, civilization. So I think what you're saying is we shouldn't assume that warfare is our natural state.
It's not warfare and in-group, out-group stuff. Again, it's functional for humans to be mindful of that, but it can be easily overridden. Doug Fry is somebody you should think about interviewing. He's an anthropologist. He's at the University of North Carolina, and he is an anthropologist that studies peaceful societies. He knows a lot about not only the anthropology, but also the archaeology of peace and peacefulness. And he has a book called War, Peace, and Human Nature. It's one of the best accounts, I think, of how oftentimes we get it wrong. When humans say, oh, we've always been warring with each other, they're only going back about 10,000 years. They're not going back 2 million years. And it's like, no, we didn't do that for most of the time. Under certain conditions, we do that. That's what we have to understand. Not that we're hardwired, but that we set up the conditions where we start to have this tribal nature.
I'm not going to get into it, but I know exactly what you're talking about. I have this debate with a lot of people, and they're like, we've always been patriarchal. And I go, no, only the last 10,000 years. You go beyond that, everything shows matriarchal. So people don't, we've been patriarchal forever since recorded history, maybe, but that doesn't mean that we weren't matriarchal for 20 times longer. So
it doesn't mean it's innate. No.
Doesn't mean it's innate. This is something I wanted to show you, and then I had another question. September 30th, 2021. New initiative explores deep, persistent divides between Biden and Trump voters at the Sabato Cristobal University of Virginia Center for Politics, pretty reputable place. And here's what the survey found. This is the original survey. Here's the findings. 80%, 74% of Biden voters and 78% of Trump voters feel all voters from the other side are a clear and present danger to the USA. Clear and present danger. I shortened it just danger, but the phrase was clear and present danger, meaning like a 9/11 or a Russian nuclear strike. I think this gets at what you're talking about, where people are not just seeing these guys have different ideas and they're not as good as mine, to these guys are the enemy, and I view them along the same level as I do ISIS.
Yeah. We see them as a bigger threat than ISIS, than terrorism or global warming or, anything else. It doesn't matter. What's really matters is them. And that is, and then the last two things you have here is about secession. People are really, and that's the conditions for civil war. When people start to say, our state should pull out. Well, that's, it's not going to happen. It's just way too demanding, but it definitely mobilizes a grievance and a fantasy that it can happen, which can perpetuate violence.
One of the other things I noticed is when the Supreme Court struck down Roe v. Wade, or passed it back to the states, however you want to see it, I saw a lot of people saying, we don't recognize the authority of the court. We will defy its ruling. We will not follow. And I recall the last time a group of people said, I don't care what your federal system is, we'll do what we please, was 1860. And yet when I talk to liberals, I'm like, do you understand what the phrase, I defy the court, I will not follow your rulings, I will not follow the law, means? And they didn't seem to. It was like, no, we're doing the right thing. And I go, this is the step. It's called nullification. It's a step right before secession. So nobody seemed to get that. Everybody, Eleni Koulounakis, the lieutenant governor of California, said, I will defy the Supreme Court. So second highest leader of the world's fifth largest economy. Second most powerful person, world's fifth largest economy, says, I don't follow the Supreme Court. Make me. So I'm like, wow, that doesn't seem stable or good for democracy. Okay.
Absolutely.
This is one of the last questions I wanted to ask you, was getting at the big sort. Let me pull this up. Okay, here we go. This is the map I show everybody. And let me pull this in here. Okay, here we go. This is from the New York Times, came out in 2016, a couple of years ago. NPR has covered this, 538. Many people have documented the big sort by Bill Bishop. So this is the map. I know it's a little bit hard to see, but roughly. The map in the top left is 1992. The map at the bottom, that's the largest one, is 2016. So if you look at the map in 2012 and 1992, those are called landslide election counties. We were talking to something about this. Red means don't even run here unless you're a Republican. You have no chance of winning. Republicans win here by 20 percentage points over the other candidate. And this is at the county scale. So this is a very fine-grained map. Blue means don't even run here if you're Republican. Democrats always win. But gray means it's competitive. Sometimes we vote for McCain. Sometimes we think a guy named Barack Obama has the better message for America at that time. You can see where gray is the dominant color in 1992. Then the map walks out to 96, 2000, 2004, 2010, and you get to 2016. Almost all the gray is completely wiped out. Meaning we have these ideologically sorted communities where Maybe there seems to be some debate if people are consciously moving to an area because it votes the way they like versus there's a general attraction to lifestyle and values.
Yeah.
And then they move out there and then they start voting the way their neighbors do,
Mhm.
just
Yeah.
interactions. So my question is this: if the map at the bottom
Yeah.
is the way it is, and I talked to another professor who said it's even worse now. He had data from 2022. He says there's even more landslide election counties. It's even worse than your 2016 map.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's take a look at that 2016 map. There's mostly red, and then there's blue.
Yeah.
One of the things that got me was I see a lot of professors saying there's no division. I have a survey that says the majority of Americans agree sensible gun regulation.
Yeah.
Women have the right to choose abortion.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. I'm like, okay, well, if that's true, why do we have polarization and we can't seem to pass any laws? But we have these surveys saying we all agree. And my theory was this. Those surveys are national. They interview 1,500 people around America, and then they split them into Republican, Democrat. My stepdad, I love.
Yeah.
I hate Trump.
Yeah.
My stepdad voted for Trump.
Yeah.
My stepdad voted for Trump for business reasons. He is disgusted by his racism. But if I was an interviewer and I said, oh, do you like Trump's racism? He would have said no.
Yeah.
And he would have been a Republican.
Yeah.
But I have friends in Oklahoma and I know people in Kentucky and Texas. And if you talk to the average person about do you hate Trump, they're going to say no. So what I'm noticing is a Republican in LA or San Francisco is not the same thing as a Republican in rural Iowa. And yet we have these surveys that lump them together. My stepdad is the same dude. My stepdad's married to a Mexican. His best friend's a Mexican. He's helped 8 people who are undocumented become citizens. Yes, he voted for Trump. He knows my mom has made it very clear. We support that man's rhetoric, and he knows to not say anything like I like what Trump said, but he's like, baby, taxes, this is for all of us. Your kid's mine. He's not the same guy as an Iowa, Kentucky thing, but I see these polls and they lump them together and they go, well, see, Republicans agree there should be common sense thing. And I'm asking myself, do you mean Republicans in New York, San Francisco, and Miami, or do you mean Republicans in this giant red blotch in Kentucky and Iowa and Missouri who probably never travel, have never left their city, have never met minorities, and have never gone to a liberal city? Every day my stepdad is reminded by liberal policies as a Republican. Is it possible that a lot of people are getting it wrong and saying, we don't have division? I have this poll that shows 79% of Americans want gun legislation. Okay, but we can't pass it. And are you talking about nationally as a population, or are you talking about states? Do you have a majority of people who support reasonable gun legislation, or do you have a majority of states that support reasonable gun legislation? And what I'm finding when you look at state-by-state survey is you don't. You have a majority of the people, but you have about 40 states where they're only 30, 40% of the population. They're a minority, but hell no, they don't want gun regulation. And so you can have polarized America by states, and yet this appearance of unity by polls. Thoughts, feelings on that? This is just a theory of mine, but there's a discrepancy here because people are saying we're unified. I'm looking at the polls. Well, this is the big sort data, and it's also true.
Again, I do think it's complicated in this way that people measure different things. Like this map that you have up, I'm not sure, is this voting patterns?
These are landslide election counties in presidential elections.
So what that tells us is that when it comes to voting for president, where you have 2 choices, right? That you're going to get people that are strong one or the other, right? And that's happening more and more. And that's an artifact of what they're measuring and what they're showing here. There was a recent study that came out. This is interesting and relevant to this, that says if you show people a red versus blue map of the U.S. versus a red, blue, and purple map, right? where you actually have places that are more, mixed in terms of its voting. Just seeing the red and blue makes people believe that there's more polarization and feel more polarized. If they see that there's a lot of purple, then they think, yeah, it's, that's reasonable, right? So part of the problem that you're describing, I think, is that when you measure something like, look, if we had ranked choice voting, and then these maps would look very differently, right?
Sure.
But we don't. We force people at the end of 4 years to make a decision between two candidates and go one direction or the other. And then you see this more and more because the stakes are high, because it is these middle groups that are leaning left or right are really important. And so you're starting to see the country filled in just on this representation. But this is not everything, because it's also true that 90% of Americans support reasonable gun control, background checks, right?
Sure.
So I think they can both be true, but I do think sometimes when we show or share representative maps like this, they do a disservice because they're only telling one piece of a very nuanced story. All this is saying is this is what's happening in presidential elections. Okay, that's obviously changing over time, but there's a reason that's changing. And if you look at other things, you see more commonality. I mean, there's a group called More in Common, and they've been studying misperception of the other. They have this quiz that you can take about how, like, I'm a Democrat, how extreme do I think Republicans are on these issues? I took it. I was off by 30%. I study this. I know this, and I still was off by 30%, right? So there is a big misperception of how divided we are. That's also true. We are actually more united on some of these policy issues, but the fact that we can't pass legislation on them is not necessarily about the popularity of them. Those are other issues like money in politics, right? Like money in politics and like the tribalism of these issues, these wedge issues like guns.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this question if I can.
Yeah, maybe just one more because
Oh, well, then let me show you this. Let me show you this.
Yeah, sure.
And we'll make this the last question.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's okay.
I hear what you're saying. Based upon the data, it can influence the level of division people feel there. Although I do think, the big sort's real. There is hard data showing it.
Sure.
Let's take a look at this. 1 second. Here we go. I'll make this the last one, and I really appreciate your time.
Sure.
So this is a map
Yeah.
of shades of purple. And map on the middle is the 2020 election by county for presidency. The map on the right is the 1968 election, the most pivotal polarized election in American history in 1968, according to historians, not my opinion. The map on the left is the 2000 election. So left is 2000. The one on the right is 68, and the one in the middle is 2020, most recently.
Right.
If you look at the map on the left from 2000, you can see a lot of light pink and light blue. If you go to the map in the center 20 years later, it's almost all wiped out. This is a purple America map, and it literally shows over the last 20 years, we've gone from I'm barely a Democrat or barely Republican to I'm hardcore red and hardcore blue. We can also compare it to the 1968 map, which was a super polarized time.
Yeah.
It's crawling with light pink and light blue.
Yeah.
And then by 2000, it's much less than 68. And by 2020, it's almost no purple left. Yeah. This is a purple map. It also shows hardcore sorting and polarization at the county level across America over a 30-year period.
Right. And this is, again, these are presidential election results?
By counties, yeah.
By counties, yeah. Again, I think what's tricky about presidential elections is that it's a national election. It's not a local election, right? And it's a forced choice between two people. Oftentimes, you don't like your candidate, but you hate the other one more, right? So, so that's part of what we're capturing here is, our system is broken, and again, I live in New York City, and we just voted, well, a year ago or so, voted for a new mayor. And we, for the first time, did ranked choice voting. And you know what? It made a difference because they actually, you could rank your choices. And so some of them started to campaign together, and the attack ads were gone. And it really affects how Americans experience politics, view politics, and understand politics, because then they're talking about the issues. They're not just making up stuff about the other side to vilify them. So, our system is broken. This is not, I don't mean that this data is false data. I think it's accurate data, but it's of a very specific phenomenon, which is part of the structure that we force every 4 years, is this dichotomous decision, right? Yeah.
Sure.
And that's part of why you're seeing these trends.
Sure. And as I always point out to everybody, most of the world's democracies do not follow the pattern of democracy we do. We have called a winner take all, where they have a multi-party parliamentary system. Almost like 80% of the world's democracies, even the democracies America tried to set up in Iraq and Afghanistan, do not follow the American model. Most of the world looks at our model and thinks that it's insane, and they want nothing to do with it, even though it's followed by Canada and England. Okay, last question. Any recommendations for anybody else that you think might be open to having an honest conversation? I hope you felt that this was a fair interview and not gotcha journalism.
Absolutely. No, I thought it was a great interview and very wide-ranging. And the only practical recommendation I'd make for folks in preparation for the 2023 to 2024 election cycle that we're about to move into big time in the fall is we've taken the ideas from the way out from the book, and we've sort of made them kind of like the select committee, made these hundreds of recommendations. We've taken these and boiled them down to small nudges you can do in your life every day. And we've called it a challenge. We call it a political courage challenge. It's on a website that is hosted by a group called Starts With Us, which is a nonprofit that is about kind of, division starts with us, unifying or creating a functional democracy starts with us. So if you go to the Starts With Us website and you look for the challenge, the political courage challenge, try it. It basically will every day for a couple of weeks send you an idea and say, here's some options of what you could do. The easiest are 5 minutes, but it's a way to start to just reflect on what role do I play in this? What role does my own in-group play? Are we being honest with each other when we talk politics? Would I consider reaching out to somebody on the other side? And what are the structures that are perpetuating this? And what can I do about those? So it walks people through these things in a kind of orderly way. So try the challenge. It's a way to take some responsibility and to take some sense of efficacy back. It's not just that Washington's messed up. We're all part of this, and we all can be part of the solution.
Thank you. I'll email you a copy of the video in a little bit. If you know anybody else who might be willing to be interviewed, I deeply, deeply appreciate it.
Fantastic. I'm happy to do that.
Okay. I'll email you soon. Thank you, Professor, for coming up.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Okay.
All right. Be well. Take care.